Hi, you came back. Oh, good. I'm glad you made it. So this is going to be part two of this little talk about nutrition for swimmers. In the first video, I was just talking about general nutritional concepts and advice that anybody should follow, whether you're a swimmer or a couch potato. Either way, that last advice is solid advice. But for this one, I want to specifically talk about what is different for your swimmers. What should they be doing different from just anybody else? And to try to make this sink in, I've decided, you know what, I'm going to start with my advice, and then I'll go around and explain sort of the logic behind each of these recommendations, and then we'll come back to this at the end. So if you're a note taker, here you go. Screenshot it, write furiously, whatever you got to do. This is my general advice for everybody. You know, it starts with eat that balanced diet, like all the things we talked about in that last video. Follow that advice, and then always stay hydrated. The easiest way to avoid dehydration, don't let yourself get dehydrated. Stay hydrated. Try to have your last meal about 2 to 4 hours before practice if you can. That sort of helps ensure that you go into the workout with all the nutrients you'll need topped off. If you can't do that, like say, for example, your lunch at school is at 11, but practice is at 4:30. Well, then just shoot to have somewhere in that hour to 2 hours before practice a high carb snack. A high carb would be like 50, 60 grams of carbs, something in that ballpark. If even that isn't possible, let's say, for example, you have practice early in the morning. I don't think any of the OCY folks do, but I know you high schoolers, some of you, I was a high school swimmer once. We practiced at 5. Um, you know, if that's the case, I always say don't go empty. You know, even if you're only 30 minutes out from practice, get something in you, a small 30-gram of carb-ish snack. If you make it low fat and low fiber, it'll digest better and it's less likely to give you stomach issues. My go-to in that situation is a bowl of cereal in skim milk. You know, tends to be in that sort of 30 to 45 grams of carb range, and at least me, I can deal with that no problem. I've got kind of an iron stomach, so you experiment, you figure out what works for you, but that's my go-to. Other advice: hour before practice, you want to drink a glass of water, something in the 8 to 16 ounce range. You know, your typical glass of water. Why 1 hour? Well, 1 hour gives you the chance to absorb what you need, and anything that's excess that you don't need, have time to process it and urinate it out. And so you won't be overhydrated, but you won't be underhydrated. The goal is be topped off. If you are in a workout that lasts more than an hour, which typically is the more advanced age groups, you know, this probably doesn't apply to the little kids so much, but by the time you're in like the you know, junior 1, junior 2, or senior age groups, this has certainly got to be you. You want to stay hydrated during practice, and I have reasons I'll get into a bit why I recommend a sports drink over just pure water. And then the last general bit of advice here is to aim to consume about 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight spread throughout the day. And like I said, I'll get into the specifics of why. Well, right now. So let's take a look at this. Why do I recommend these things? Well, to give you sort of a starting sense of what this is all about, let's look at what I kind of refer to as the nutrient cycle. Every one of those 6 essential nutrients that we talked about in the last video, they undergo this kind of life cycle. First, they get consumed. You eat them, now they're in your body. Next step, they go to your gut, stomach, and intestines, where they get digested and absorbed. Once they're absorbed, they can be, you know, spread throughout your body to all the different places that they need to go, and they can be stored. You know, some things get stored for very short periods of time. Other things get stored for, you know, 3, 4, 5 weeks or longer. But everything has at least some capacity to be stored in your body, and then when you need it, it'll get used. And once it's used, it is excreted. And that is basically what determines how much you need to consume, right? How much of this am I excreting it? At what rate am I excreting it? Once it's gone, it needs to be replaced. That's the whole reason we eat at all. So, what makes nutrition for an athlete different? Essentially, if you are doing something, if you're an activity where you now excrete things, use and excrete things at a faster rate than a normal person, then you need to consume more of that nutrient than a normal person would. Um, and so, like, the specifics of what this means is different for different sports. But for swimmers, there's primarily three nutrients that I worry about, and they are first and foremost water, carbohydrates, and then protein. So let's look at those three things individually, starting with um, hydration. So, water in your body, like I said, it does a lot of things, but when you think about it, we're trying to maintain balance, is really our goal. We want to be fairly steady in our amount of water in our body. So we intake water mainly through food and drink. The food, you don't often think about it, but a lot of the food you eat, every fruit, vegetable, a lot of meat products, they have water in them as well. So a fair amount of the water you get comes from those things. Your body also makes a little bit of water through metabolism. Like every time you digest a carbohydrate, you're also creating a certain amount of water and carbon dioxide. And while the carbon dioxide gets exhaled, the water can be put to other uses. So we have these ways of getting water in, and then we have the ways that we lose water. Mainly, we lose water through urine. You also are constantly losing water through like breathing. Every time, on a cold day, you breathe out a window or a mirror or something like that, and it gets fogged up. That's a sign that you're losing water when you breathe. And then there's this idea of sweat. A typical person, that's what this number is. Just even if you're relatively sedentary, the 450 milliliters, that's about a pound, roughly, how much you will sweat in a given day. But if you're active, right, if you're exercising, if you're doing something with intensity, it tends to raise your body temperature. And that's the reason you sweat, is to help maintain that body temperature. So if you're doing something active, this number goes up. It's fairly easy for an athlete working hard to, sweat triple this amount in an hour. If you are working extra hard. And this is like the tricky thing about swimming, is that you don't realize you're sweating. Like when I go for a run, it's very obvious that I'm sweating. You'll see it. My clothes get all wet and I look all raggedy, and it's obvious, but it isn't obvious for swimmers. But trust me, if you're working really hard, and I've been watching practices, they work pretty hard. They are sweating. And so you're going to need to put that back. And the best way to do it is, well, two things. First of all, make sure that you are sort of optimally hydrated to start with. That's why the recommendation about an hour beforehand, have a glass of water, that'll give you time to absorb what you need, excrete the rest, and you'll start fairly optimal. The other part is to drink while you are working out. And I know the coaches always stress having a water bottle at practice. I haven't heard as much about what you should put in the water bottle. And if you are working really hard for longer than an hour, if it's shorter than an hour, water's fine. The really young athletes that don't swim very far, or they're mostly working on form and less about, it's less about a workout, they might not need anything at all. But if you're, out there for an hour and 45 minutes to 2 hours working hard, you really should have some sort of a sports drink. Gatorade is a good example of this. I'm not actually joking when I say there's probably been more research into Gatorade than there has been on water. And the primary thing you're looking for is something that also does electrolytes, particularly sodium and potassium, because as you sweat, you will lose those as well. And if you only put water back, then you will end up sort of out of balance with those electrolytes. So the thing that Gatorade has going for it is that it has a fairly large amount of sodium and a little bit of potassium in it as well that will help keep that balance as you rehydrate. So like I said, if you're on the shorter end, like an hour or less, it's probably not a big deal to not worry about it. But the longer you go, the more you really should. So if there's another reason I like Gatorade, I'll get to in a second. But one important side note is when I say sports drink, sports drink is not an energy drink. So there's a lot of products out there that refer to themselves as energy drinks, and a lot of them sort of market themselves like they're for athletes. Red Bull comes to mind. But Red Bull is not a sports drink. Red Bull is an energy drink. It's high in caffeine. It's high in sugar. A lot of them have B vitamins or something like that in them. But they're there to kind of give you a jolt. A sports drink is primarily there to put back fluids and electrolytes. And it might also have some sugar in it as well. Gatorade does, and that's not a bad thing for a reason I'll get into in just a second. But there are also, if you don't want the sugar, there are sugar-free options. There's sugar-free Gatorade. I use a product a lot running called Noon, which comes in a little tablet form. I will warn you that at least my daughter thinks it tastes terrible, so your kid probably won't like it either. Gatorade's a good choice. More about that in a second. So that's the goal for hydration, right? We got to maintain this balance. You don't have to put back 100% of what you sweat out immediately. As a general rule of thumb, by the time you've lost about 2 to 3% of your body weight through sweat, that's the point where your performance really starts to suffer. So if you're sweating, a typical swimming athlete, if they're sweating, 2 to 3 pounds in an hour, and they have a 2-hour praxis, they're probably got to be looking to drink, at least 1 or 2 of these bottles during that time to sort of offset some of the sweat that they're losing and keep their body weight within that range. And if you've ever feel like getting really high tech about it, you could try weighing yourself before and after to see how much you actually sweat in a practice. That could be tricky for swimming though, because you're gonna, absorb water in your clothes, absorb water in your hair. It's fishy. So you could just kind of go by feel, I think is probably a good plan. Now, a more challenging topic here is carbohydrates. So I mentioned before, carbohydrates, we tend to think of them as energy. Fat is also something we use for energy. There's 2 differences. Like carbohydrates are the go-to source for when you need a lot of energy. Like if you're doing something that requires, what in mechanics we would call power. You're cranking out, you're doing a lot of work in a relatively short amount of time. That has to come from carbs. It can't come from fat. The other thing about carbs is that you have a relatively limited amount you can store. Your typical body can store maybe 500 grams total of carbs. Whereas fat is like virtually unlimited. If there is an upper limit to how much fat your body can store, we have not found it yet. From the looks of society, we're trying to find it, but we haven't found it yet. But carbs is limited, only about 500 grams. And so it's hard to figure out exactly how many grams of carbs your body is going to burn through swimming. I've been on a little bit of a quest to figure this out recently, and it's way more complicated than I thought. But the most simple answer I could give you is probably it's in the ballpark of about 60 grams for every 1,000 meters or so, or 1,000 yards that you swim, particularly if you're going hard. So with that set in mind, like carbs are very unlikely to ever be, they'll never be the limiting factor in a race. And they're not likely to be the limiting factor in a practice either, except for this. So imagine like you start a workout and you're pretty close to topped off with your carbs. you swam like 5,000 yards. So you burn through about 300 grams, and then you end up, here's your fuel gauge, right? I'm low on carbs at this point, but that's to be expected. I just did a lot of work, and now I get out of the pool, I go home, I eat dinner, I eat over the course of the next day, but I don't eat 300 grams of carbs between that practice and the next practice. So I only get up to here before it's time to get back in the pool again. And now I've got another 5,000 yards. And so now I'm even lower than I was before. And if you routinely do this, like, you will get to a place where you are carbohydrate depleted all the time. And that will affect your performance in the pool. And if you can't, practice well, that'll affect your performance in race as well. There's a lot of other like warning signs that this is happening to you. Chronic fatigue is probably the biggest one. If you're just like, even if you're getting a good night's sleep and all the other things you're supposed to do, if you're just tired all the time, there's a very good chance carbohydrate fatigue. You're just depleted because you're not putting it back quick enough. There's a few other things it might be, but that's probably the simplest explanation. You're not putting the carbs back fast enough. So that's the other thing I like about Gatorade. So if you're looking for a strategy to help mitigate this, the bottle, this is the bottle I put here is I believe the 28-ounce bottle. This bad boy probably has something close to 50 grams of carbs in it. So if you drink one of these over the course of that 5,000 yard practice, well, now you're not down 300, you're only down 250. You've made your job that much easier. So the general recommendation is, if you are in an advanced age group, a group that's going to be putting down a lot of yards at speed routinely, you want to get in the habit of, as soon as practice is done, starting to put a lot of those carbs back. As a general rule of thumb, I try to avoid liquid calories, soft drinks, sweet tea. I mean, heck, even milk is like good for you, but it should be limited. You shouldn't drink it all the time. I have a glass of milk a day and maybe a bowl of yogurt in the morning, something like that, but like, I wouldn't drink it all the time. But in this particular case, a sugary drink can be your friend, because there's a lot of sugar in a can of Coke. So if there was ever a time to have one, like, it's right after a hard workout. Your body will be especially primed to absorb those carbs after you've depleted it. And it can help you put a lot of that stuff you missed back. Also, just planning on having, a high carb snack right afterwards. Fruits are always a good option. Grains, snacks, Oreo cookies. I never thought I'd be recommending Oreo cookies as a nutritional supplement. And to be clear, if you're in one of those younger age groups, like I said, that tend to have shorter practices and they're more focused on form than on yards, that this advice doesn't really apply to you. You don't need to worry about this. Just eat a balanced diet. You'll be fine. But this is those advanced age group swimmers that are pulling down heavy yardage every day and need to be able to put it back fast so that they're ready to go again. These are the situations where right after practice, like, a good high carb snack can make a big difference. And so, like, if I think a typical swimmer, like, comes from school, probably has like a little high carb snack shortly before practice to try to get topped off, gets drained during practice, right after, try to get that high carb snack. And how high carb is high carb? It's hard to get a lot more unless you're having something like a Coke. It's hard to get a lot more than 60 grams in a sitting. But if you do something like that, shoot for like 60 grams as quick as you can, and then have a regular dinner, carry on the next day with your usual diet, you should be fine. But something to keep an eye on, like I said, like, the telltale sign is if you're just getting tired, more and more tired every day, that could be a real sign that you're just not putting the carbs back, and it will affect you quite a bit if you don't. All right. Protein for muscle repair and growth. So I think I mentioned this in the last video, but protein is really amino acids. All right. So I like to think of them like Legos. Like amino acids are the individual bricks. Um, and your body will put them together to make structures that we call proteins. Things like collagen and the different fibers that make up muscles, things like that, they're all proteins. So when you're eating protein in food, this is my Lego duckies here. This is the protein in my food. You eat that, as you digest it, your body takes the little duckies and they break it down into the amino acids. That's what your body absorbs. And then it takes those and uses it to build new proteins, in this case, the rocket. So, and why do you need to keep eating these things? Well, a couple of reasons. But so imagine, like, say, the rocket is your muscle. Over the course of regular wear and tear in a day, you're going to do little bits of damage to this. How your body repairs that is essentially the little parts that are damaged. They take it apart. If any of the bricks are no good, you'll get rid of it. And then you have what we call an amino acid pool, where it will just pull out the bricks that it needs to repair it, and off you go. So everybody needs this to a certain degree. But if you are an athlete, like you're putting your body through even more wear and tear, well, then you're going to need a bigger amino acid pool to help repair more damage than a normal person was. And it goes double if, like, you're an athlete who's trying to build muscle, right? It's like adding a second rocket here. Not only do I need enough bricks to repair the rocket, but I need extra bricks to build a second rocket. And if you're an athlete and you're building muscle and you're also growing, right? If you're at that, 11, 12, 13, up to maybe 17, 18, 19 for some boys age group, well, then you really need a lot of extra bricks, because you're building not just muscle, but all kinds of things: bones, skins, ligaments, tendons, etc. And so, like, how much do you need? Sort of normal, the normal recommendation is about, a half a gram per pound body weight for just a normal everyday person. For the athlete, particularly the athletes, like I said, if you're younger, if you're growing, double that, about 1 gram per pound is probably a reasonable target. But the nice thing about this is you could spread this throughout the day. With the carbs, it's kind of important to get it quickly after you're depleted. The faster you put those back, the better a shape, or at least the faster you start putting them back, the better you will recover. Protein, there's a little bit of evidence that maybe having it right after a hard workout is optimal, but it's weaker and it doesn't seem to make that big of an impact. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you need this right after the workout. You just need it in your diet in general. And if you follow a typical American diet, if you're like my kids who live off of chicken tenders, there's a good chance they eat that much protein already, and you might not need to do anything at all. If when in doubt, if you really want to find out, like, keep a journal, right? Everything they eat for a week, write it all down, and then you can sort of take an average and figure out how much protein am I getting a day. If you need more, I highly recommend the protein powder supplements. They're sold all over the place. On a per serving basis, they're fairly cheap. Usually something on the order of like 50 cents a serving, something like that. They're very convenient. It's easy to keep a little Tupperware thing full of it in a bag, and then after practice, dump it into a bottle, shake it up, and you've got your protein, and you're putting your water back at the same time. They don't all taste great, so you could play around with it to find one you do like. My only one caveat is I've noticed, like, if you go to the grocery store, you'll generally find 2 protein powder supplements. You'll have one that's marketed towards, like, senior citizens, like Ensure, something like that. And you'll have another that's marketed toward athletes. And if you read the directions on the packet for the one marketed toward athletes, the directions will often, like, instruct you to take a ludicrous amount of protein. Like, typically they come with a scoop The scoop will usually have something like 30 grams of protein in that scoop, and the directions on one of them said have mix 2 scoops in with water and drink that before your workout, and then have another 2 scoops with water after your workout. That's a full 120 grams. That's probably as much as you need in a whole day. Not right now. In most cases, like I find, you're just trying to supplement what you're already getting your diet. 1 scoop is probably enough, unless you are an absolute beefcake. One's probably plenty. And if you're wondering, you don't need the one that's marketed toward the athlete. The one marketed toward the seniors is basically the same thing, and it's just as good. Price wise, it doesn't seem to make a difference as far as I can tell. So, I would go by flavor. Which one does your swimmer think tastes the best? That's the one I would shoot for. All right, so that brings us back full circle to these recommendations that I hope make a little bit more sense now. Like just general recommendations for the diet of an athlete. Balance. Always eat that balanced diet like we talked about before. Stay hydrated throughout your day. Top off the carbs with a meal 2 to 4 hours before practice. And if that's not possible, well, at least get some kind of high carb snack in before. Top off your hydration about an hour beforehand with a glass of water. If you're going to be doing long, hard workouts like the older age groups do, sport drink is a good idea rather than water. And I do really like Gatorade. They don't pay me to say that, unfortunately, but like I said, it's been researched more than water, and it's just the stuff you need. It's sugar to put back some of the carbs you're losing, and it's electrolytes to keep you unbalanced. Hard to go wrong with good old Gatorade, and they sell it everywhere, so that's not bad stuff. And then, like for the same by the same token, for those groups that are working really hard, don't forget, trying to put those carbs back quick after practice. And then just in general, think about 1 gram of protein per pound body weight per day, just as a target throughout the day, or how much protein you are trying to get. And don't forget, parents, if you're doing this for yourself and you're not super active, like cut that number in half. That's too much for you. But for the athletes, that's a good number to shoot for. And that's, basically it, but fundamentally, the thing we talked about in the last video, where's my laser pointer? The balanced diet, the choose my plate thing, that's 90% of it, right? If you do none of this and just do that, you're still doing pretty good. You'll be okay. But if you're trying to get just a little bit more out of your nutrition, these are the things that will help you out with that. So I hope this has been helpful. And feel free to reach out to me if you have questions. MWORTLEY at origin.eu is my email address if you're trying to ask a question. And I'll make a handful of little shorty videos sometime soon just to go over a few like frequently asked question topics. But so keep an eye out for those in the future. Thanks.